thank you for that was an excellent use of time. Thank you. Wonderful story and very, very important to be told. Thank you, Christine, also and your team for a most delightful dinner at midday. All bodes well for tea tonight.
You better find time for a walk.
But really, your hospitality here is superb, just by the way. Jordan Redding, Reverend Dr. Jordan Redding, introduced himself so well this morning, I don't know what I can say in introducing him, other than the fact that since he arrived in Dunedin as a little nipper, following in his old man's footsteps, as he had just been appointed as principal at the Theological College at Knox, I've known Jordan, and it has been an absolute pleasure to have been alongside him in all sorts of ways over that time. One of the earliest memories, Jordan, would be receiving your first album, your first LP, or I call them LPs, I suppose it was a CD, Came Inside. Jordan is an accomplished musician and writer and songwriter. Beautiful singing voice and leads from the front in music so well. And this started at an early age when he arrived in Dunedin. He became part of our youth group at church, and from there went on to do his own study. Reading as a name is synonymous with Presbyterianism in New Zealand, but mark my words, although this apple hasn't fallen far from the tree, he is his own man, not to be confused with his father Graham Redding, but indeed is one unique being. I'm in the privileged position now of being part of his congregation. Jordan is now my minister. I sit under his teaching on Sunday nights at Knox, and Kerry and I both enjoy that immensely. His pastoral care, his attention to detail, his ability to pull together liturgy and to tell the Jesus story to all and sundry that turn up at Knox on a Sunday night, waifs and strays from all over the city. So it is with great pleasure I introduce again Reverend Dr. Jordan Redding as he shares with us more about this thing we call Presbyterianism. Jordan.
Well, Barry, thank you. That was quite some introduction. And you have been one of the witnesses in my life to the rock from which I've been hewn. And so I owe standing here today partly to you for the role you've played in forming my faith. I realise I've got the graveyard shift, so I'm going to try to do a bit of resurrecting power here and keep you guys awake. But if you do happen to find yourself dead to the world, actually a lot of what I'm going to say crosses over with what Hamish was talking about earlier. So if you listen to him, you've done pretty well, and I haven't got too much more to add, but I do want to bring my own spin to things. Really today I want to flesh out what I began in the chapel service, to reflect on Isaiah's words, an invitation to look to the rock from which we've been hewn. And I don't have a PowerPoint, which was maybe a mistake, but actually I want this chapel to be the visual of my talk, because this chapel expresses architecturally what I'm trying to say. The memorial wall behind us, always with us, as we face the future, and the gathered community in the present, in that liminal space between past and future, as we look to the rock from which we've been hewn. This is a glorious chapel. Thank you, Christine, for your introduction to this place, which was a great introduction to what I'm about to say, so thank you very much. Before I do begin though, I just want to also acknowledge David's talk, which I thought was very much complimentary, and I want it to be heard alongside what I'm going to say. Because my trip to Iona was a reminder for me that we are grounded in a tradition that goes across space and time, a truly global movement that goes back through Scotland, Geneva, all the way back to Jesus Christ. But that tradition is also firmly rooted in this family. in this land. And it needs to be shaped by these stories as well. And so I've got my... Oh no, I've got my pebble, and I'm going to Mohope Marae in a couple of months, and my intention is to get a pebble from Mohope to complement this one, to remind me that I'm from a global movement as well as one that is firmly rooted in this place. So, look to the rock from which we've been hewn. An invitation from Isaiah to remember, to root ourselves deeply in the past, and in so doing to better withstand the storms of the present, the uncertainties of the time we live in. And our present day is certainly uncertain. It often appears to me that we live in a culture that doesn't equip our young people particularly well to withstand the storms of life. We live in a culture addicted to the present, a culture that lays shallow roots, a culture of instant gratification that encourages us to fill every void with short-term material comforts. If I can push the metaphor a little further, a culture that over-farms the soil for the harvest now, and in the process sucks the soil dry for the long term. The rather forced metaphor is my way of saying, if we become too absorbed in the present, we risk losing touch with our past, uprooting ourselves, cutting ourselves off from the very thing that sustains us, exposing ourselves to the winds of change, no longer knowing who we are. When we lose our individual and collective memory, we lose our identity, the particular idiosyncratic recollections that make us who we are, the collective memories that hold us in relationship with one another. In short, the stuff that makes us human. There's been a great deal of impassioned discussion recently on the new NZQA Histories curriculum. I'm sure you've been following that in your schools. Questions have been raised. What histories should we be teaching our young people? What should be excluded? What should be included? And perhaps most importantly, who controls the narrative of what we're telling? These discussions, I think, and just how impassioned they've been, show how important history is. Our history is part of the architecture of our identity, as one commentator recently said. The stories we tell shape who we understand ourselves to be. They orient us in the present. So with that in mind, what does it mean to be proudly Presbyterian today? To be unashamedly quarried from this reformed rock? Our tradition is a deep well from which to draw. And as schools with a special Presbyterian character, I would argue perhaps the most valuable thing we can offer to our young people is our stories, our traditions, a tradition to be rooted in, to thrive in, to live and to grow in. So if we were looking over the woven tapestry of Presbyterianism in Aotearoa in New Zealand, what common threads would we find? I did a bit of research for this talk, and some of the threads I found I didn't particularly like. And I also discovered that we are a very broad and diverse tradition. So being proudly Presbyterian, I think, doesn't mean that we hide the bits we don't like, but being brutally honest with ourselves, owning the ugly bits and weaving them into who we are today as we seek to bring healing and reconciliation. I've picked 3 threads that I want to dwell on. By no means an exhaustive list, but significant threads in our story that I think continue to have much to offer. So the first distinctive thread is exactly what I've been talking about, and what I think David was talking about in his talk. A Presbyterian instinct to look ever again to the rock from which we've been hewn, to look to the stories of the Bible, and to allow our communal life and our imagination to be shaped by those stories. In short, we belong to a tradition deeply committed to opening the Bible in our schools, to learning its stories, to reading them with a critical eye, and importantly with allowing those stories to critically read us. Hamish talked about the big existential questions that our young people face, allowing the biblical stories to help us to engage with the existential questions. Ivan, you mentioned the birth of many of our Presbyterian church schools. It was this commitment to open the Bible in our schools that gave birth to many of our church schools in the first place. For many years in early colonial New Zealand society, there was a fierce public debate in the public square as to whether the Bible should be taught in our state schools. We've already touched on this. As early as 1877, there was a secular clause in our Education Act which banned the teaching of Bible and religious education in state schools. And around the turn of the century, despite a big push to try and reintroduce religious education, it became increasingly clear that there was a lack of political will to do so. The secular roots in our New Zealand culture grow deep and remain strong today. And we've already heard a little bit from Hamish as to what might be driving that. The fear that we might be indoctrinating our children. So in the secular age we live in, what do we do with the fact that the founders of many of our church schools believed firmly in the teaching of the Bible in our schools? A conviction that led us all to be sitting here today. One historian notes that the low point in Bible in schools was the high point in Presbyterian church school foundation. Iona College, St Cuthbert's, Columba College, Scots, St Andrews, Solway, John McGlashan, Queen Margaret were all founded in the 1910s out of this discussion of teaching the Bible in our schools. The vigour with which Presbyterians founded church schools around the country points, I think, to a firmly held conviction that biblical and religious literacy is utterly central to the formation of a mature and thoughtful faith. Without diminishing the importance of a more general religious education, and again, sorry to keep picking on you, Hamish, but you've already touched on the importance of learning about the other religions, particularly Islam, post the Christchurch shootings, as a way of combating Islamophobia. Without diminishing the importance of a more general religious education, we can nonetheless maintain a confidence in introducing our young people to the stories of the Bible and acquainting them with the history of Christianity and in resourcing them to critically and engage with the biblical texts. For a couple of very good reasons. Firstly, as an historic text alone, the Bible is incredibly important for understanding where we come from and our current global culture. The rise and development of Western civilization cannot be rightly conceived without a proper understanding of the contribution of a Judeo-Christian worldview which has its roots in the Bible. Our ethical assumptions, much of Western art and literature and music that has captured the Western imagination, the rise of modern science, even our linear and progressive view of time, all of these have been informed by the Bible. Even more than that, the Bible is an historic text that helps us to better understand and engage with our history here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, since colonial times, I should add. A text that helps us to better critique the mistakes of our past, to find a common language, to work towards reconciliation and healing in the present. In a recent article written by Professor Murray Ray in the Otago Daily Times, he talks about the complex history of Christianity in New Zealand, which is often messily intertwined with Māori-Pākehā relations. The likes of Te Whiti o Rongomai from Parihaka, Uruakenana from the Urewera and other Māori prophets found in the Bible a basis for their pacifist, non-violent resistance against the Crown. And while Christianity has been used and is still used to justify colonial imperialism, many Pākehā missionaries, were some of the staunchest advocates for Māori. We can't go into the detail now, but there is much in our shared history that's cause for celebration, and there's much in our history that is cause for sorrow. And as Ray knows, truth-telling about our history, whether it's in our churches or in our schools, opens us up to the possibility of reconciliation and a future that will be better than the past. Biblical literacy, I think, is central to this task of honest truth-telling, of better enabling our young people to critically engage with our shared past and to contribute constructively to a better future. Before I move on, I want to touch on one final reason of why I think the Bible is important. Within the Christian faith, the Bible is more than merely an historic text that helps us to understand the past. It is a living devotional text through which we expect to hear the prompting of God. The Bible invites us into a story that gives voice to the breadth and depth of our human experience. The great themes of the Bible: creation, covenant, stewardship, exodus, exile, reconciliation, redemption. They are powerful narrative devices through which we can better make sense of and orient our human existence. Again, in the uncertainties of our present age, the exploration of the Bible as a devotional text is an act of looking to the rock from which we've been hewn and finding there a deep source of hope as we navigate the times. The second thread I want to pick up on is linked to the first. Presbyterians have long emphasised the central importance of learning, of education, for flourishing, healthy human community. That's why many Presbyterian churches look like lecture theatres. Not this chapel, thankfully. Many of our Presbyterian churches look more like lecture theatres than temples, sparsely decorated, uncomfortable pews, rigid lines facing the pulpit. These are places of learning, our architecture says. What is communicated in many Presbyterian churches is a deep instinct that goes back to the very beginnings of Reformed Christianity, all the way back to Geneva in the 1500s. Geneva in the 1500s had a very low literacy rate, I think of about 5% at the time. And the widespread ignorance was fertile breeding ground for superstition, corruption, and abuse by the Catholic Church of the day. John Calvin, along with other reformers, sought to address these injustices. How? By putting the Bible in the hands of the people, by teaching them to read, educating them, teaching them to think for themselves, to empower the people to return directly to the rock from which they have been hewn. And that emphasis on education came to Scotland through Geneva, through John Knox. Knox was a refugee in Geneva for a time, and while he was there, he was strongly influenced by Calvin and brought Calvin's ideas back to Scotland. And so in 1561, Knox and a small group of fellow clergy set out a national program for reform, including the virtuous education and godly upbringing of the youth of this realm. Knox's vision was remarkably radical for its time. He envisioned a school in every parish, and even more remarkably, he advocated free education for those who couldn't afford it. Education must not be the privilege of the elite. Such a vision led to the remarkable advances in the Scottish education system that quickly pushed it ahead of England and many European nations. Early Presbyterian settlers brought that similar vision to colonial New Zealand, and nowhere is it more evident than in Dunedin, the Edinburgh of the South, where the Presbyterian Church was involved in the establishment of New Zealand's first university, Otago, as well as Otago boys and Otago girls. The Reverend Thomas Burns of First Church was the first Chancellor of the university, and he was an outspoken advocate for universal accessible education. Admittedly, the reality in Dunedin never lived up to the vision, and yet the commitment to education is nonetheless impressive. All of this points, I think, to a tradition that is deeply invested in building communities of learning. A tradition that saw clearly the inherent value of education for a healthy, flourishing society. A tradition that was not in the business of making its youth more religious, but of empowering them to be more humane, more fully human. A tradition that sees the church integrated and deeply engaged with wider community life, its politics, its business, its academia, its culture. In short, whether in the classroom or around the communion table, we are learning what it means to be fully and wonderfully human within this world we call home. All of this suggests that a proudly Presbyterian education consists in more than preparing our young people to pass exams. It consists in more than producing high-achieving and successful students. It consists in more than equipping our young people for today's workforce. Education must consist in a deeper formation. It strikes me that many of the problems facing our world today cannot be solved with more facts, more science, and more technological innovation alone. For all the advances we have made in science and technology, superstition, intolerance, conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation are endemic in our society. We have not come so far as we might like to think from the suspicious and ignorant Geneva of Calvin's day. We are discovering in our current climate that human beings more often than not make decisions with their gut rather than their head. For instance, it's one thing to understand climate change as an abstract problem. It's another matter entirely to change our personal and communal ways of living. The latter requires a change of heart, a change of soul. Here, once more, our tradition is a deep well from which to draw. We are well placed to build communities of learning that incorporate formative and transformative practices. A broad and deep education that integrates practices of prayer, of confession, of lament, of thanksgiving, of loving service, practices that take us beyond ourselves, that give us language to negotiate the challenges of our age, and that cultivate in our young people humility, compassion, and grace. The formal theological word for this is liturgy. Expressions, movements of our common life that invite our young people into a different way of being human, that invite them to imagine new possibilities for a future that is better than the present, that gives them words and language to put around their grief, their stress, their anxiety, their sadness. It leads me to the third and final distinctive thread, the centrality of Sabbath, rest. This is the shortest, and given that I'm talking about rest, if you do need to take a rest, I won't be offended. Presbyterians were well known for their Calvinist work ethic. Diligent, disciplined, frugal. Such a work ethic, coupled with a strict moral piety, gave rise to the stereotype that Presbyterians were dour, humorless, judgmental, hard-working, stick-in-the-muds, unable to enjoy life. Which is not an entirely inaccurate description. At the centre of their moral piety was the observance of the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, on which, and I quote, whistling, cooking, unnecessary travel, amusement, and any frivolity were frowned upon. Sabbath breaking was sternly denounced, at times verging on the ridiculous. Many farmers, for instance, needed to take their milk to the factory every day or else risk it spoiling. And one reporter for the Presbyterian Outlook once advised farmers to take that risk of their milk spoiling, for Sunday milk delivery is a sin on par with prostitution and the opium trade. Why have I chosen this as my final thread? Well, because the strict observance of the Sabbath was a vital antidote to the Calvinist work ethic. An intentional break in the midst of the industriousness, a whole day devoted to rest, to recreation, to learning together, to caring for the neglected. Work, yes, and rest. Life and liturgy. Perspiration and prayer. Presbyterians saw the whole of life necessarily balanced between these two poles. Worship informs our work in the world and vice versa. The two deeply integrated as the whole of life is oriented in service to God. It seems to me that today we've gotten things out of balance. In short, we overwork and we overconsume. Both of these are product of an economic system dependent on economic constant growth. A system that reduces humans at times to consumers and cogs in an economic machine. And both of these are nothing short of disastrous for us and for our planet. The Calvinist work ethic remains alive and well, but without the pious resting part. Our schools and universities, highly competitive environments, can actually at times embed this philosophy from an early age in our young people. Students are pressured by their peers, no less, to spend every waking hour studying and going over notes, lest they slip behind the pack, lest they don't succeed. It's no surprise to me in my chaplaincy work at the university that mental health issues relating to stress, lack of sleep, and overwork are commonplace. We live in a society that encourages us to stretch our roots widely, but not deeply, to grow quickly, but not sustainably, to produce a bumper crop, but not to withstand the storms that come in the winter. And so we've come full circle. Sabbath practices are practices that break the busyness, that disrupt the ceaseless cycle, that provide space for our roots to grow deeply. Sabbath rhythms recognise the importance of rest and recreation for our own sustainability and, importantly, for the sustainability of the earth. Sabbath observance dignifies, celebrates our humanity. It reminds us that we are human beings. We're more than cogs in an economic machine. We're more than winners and losers. We're more than consumers. We're reminded that the goal of life is not simply to work and consume, but to live in joyous relationship with God and with one another. Really, in my 3 threads that I've brought today, I think I've just said the same thing in 3 different ways. I probably could have shortened it a lot. That to be proudly Presbyterian today means to be part of a living tradition. We find in our past the architecture of our identity now. When we look to the reformed rock from which we've been hewn, we'll see a lot that is forgettable, a lot that needs to be challenged, a lot that needs to be confronted. But we will also find rich veins that run deep into the earth, veins that continue to offer much today. I've tried to show that we're not so far from the early Presbyterians in colonial New Zealand, or from John Calvin's Geneva, or indeed from the characters we read about in the Bible. We find that their problems are not so different from our own, that we share a common humanity, that we're being invited into a shared story, pebbles hewn from the same rock, being smoothed by the common river, and being swept out eventually to the vast ocean, when God will be all in all. Thank you.
I was lucky enough to train with Jordan, 5, 6 years ago. We crossed over for a year. And when Presbyterian ministers get together, we do lots of things. We often drink whiskey. We also often lament at the state of our church. 3 weeks ago, I was lucky enough to be up at Church Marae, Ahopi, with Kerry Enright, who Jordan shares the leadership of Knox Church in Dunedin with. And I asked Kerry, what's given you hope right now in our church? And without missing a beat, he said, Jordan Reading. And we can see that there's so much in what you've said today. It was so rich, and I certainly want a copy of it. And I think the topic was proudly Presbyterian, and I, for one, and I expect all of us here, and now, as a result of what you have shared